welcome back to Building a Fighter. My name is Dr. Austin Shane, sports chiropractor in Scottsdale, Arizona. With me, as always, badass strength coach in Denver, Colorado, Alex Friedman. For this episode, we're going to get our sport coaching on. Both me and Alex in the past have been wrestling coaches, still wrestling coaches, work with different fight teams on the grappling aspect of things. And we're going to bring to you guys what are the top 5 mistakes that we see on the grappling side of things for MMA fighters? Alex, what's number one?
Number one is the failure to manage your distance and your timing on your shots, right? Which we felt was a very obvious lack in a lot of people's games. And obviously, it's a hard skill to master,
Mm-hmm.
right? But I see so many people, especially when we get tired, especially when there's a little desperation involved or we're getting outstruck, just take a shot from, you know, 3 feet out, right? And that's not the time to take a shot. That's not a well managed shot. It's easily defensible shot. Um, and it's low percentage. I would say it's a little less risky than a poorly timed shot. I think a poorly
Yeah,
timed shot gets you to eat a knee or gets you
yeah.
to catch an uppercut or ton of different things. But you have to manage both of those things on your timing and your distance when you're deciding to shoot in and try and get a takedown, right? There's a couple different ways to get a takedown, but if we're in the open canvas, open mat, and we want to force the wrestling, then we have to do a lot of work there to feel the timing off of our opponent's strike and to manage our distance and be in the right place for the takedown.
Right. I'll separate them out. Distance. For distance, a wrestling distance is going to be a boxing distance. If
Right.
you're throwing kicks, you're not close enough to wrestle. I'm sorry, but unless you're Jordan Burroughs, you're not close enough to wrestle. And even he is going to have trouble because he's probably catching a knee or an uppercut on the way in. You need to be close if we're trying to wrestle. So taking that desperation shot, like Alex is talking about, is only going to do it's only going to do things to hurt you. It's not going to help you. If you're diving in, especially like I see this a lot in like the third round, when people are tired and they want to put a stamp on something. They like want to make their mark, but they don't set up their takedown well. They don't do what they need to do to close the distance and then be able to get that takedown to put a stamp on things. They just take a shitty double leg with their head down. They try to drive them to the cage and then they get stuck on the cage. And one of the things we're going to get to later in the podcast is cage wrestling and inactivity. You just get stuck on the cage. Nobody fucking does anything. They just
Mm-hmm.
hang there and just hope that that kind of quote unquote control time is going to allow them to win this round. And that's not always the case. So for distance, we have to make sure we get into boxing range if we're going to be wrestling. If you can't throw a punch and hit him, there's no way you can get to his legs or to his body and score a successful takedown. Now, timing. I kind of alluded to it in the first part, but the timing element of wrestling is probably the most important part when we try to transition from pure wrestling into MMA. You need to know when you're going after your takedowns or if you're just a takedown specialist. Like this is the difference between like a Marab who all he does is takedowns
Right.
but his timing is impeccable because he's always going forward. He's always trying to suffocate. He's always in wrestling range. So his timing doesn't really matter as much because he just keeps hitting those. I think he hit 49 shots
World
against
record.
Peter Yan. Like he broke a record by a good mark, like 25%.
Mm.
And so his timing doesn't have to matter as much. If you have that gas tank, then timing isn't as big of a concern. But if you're the type of person that like you use one takedown and get 3 minutes of control time, that one takedown, that timing needs to be impeccable.
Yeah.
And what I mean by that is you have to set it up behind your strikes typically. Unless you're a amazing athlete in wrestling, you probably aren't going to be able to use just like an inside like a collar tie like you can normally in wrestling. You're not going to be
Right.
able to use like a misdirection like John Jones has hit a low single one time. The only low single in MMA fucking history.
To ever
Guess
work.
what?
Yeah.
There's a reason why it doesn't work in MMA. I wish it did. I love low singles. That'd be pretty fucking dope, but it doesn't work in MMA. You got to set it up behind your hands or behind your feet and then be able to work your way in. So that's number one for timing. Number two for timing is you have to make sure that you're doing it in a part of a round that you can exert energy.
Yeah.
So I've seen this mistake with fighters I've cornered and coached. I've seen this mistake across the board in the UFC and Bellator, where you get somebody that comes from a striking background, they go to a wrestling gym, they get better at wrestling, but they don't have the energy systems in place to be able to support wrestling in the third round.
Yeah.
So then they take a desperation shot in the third round because they've had wrestling drilled into their head
And they
this
do it
whole camp.
in the first 90 seconds of the third round.
Right. And but then they get absolutely fucking exhausted because they haven't been wrestling their whole life.
Right.
I stand by this. If you're a striking background, there's no need to dive on a desperation shot, right? Stick to what you're good at, stick to what your body knows. It knows how to manage your energy in a striking lens way more than a grappling lens.
Yeah.
So don't just dive on a shitty shot in order to chew up the time, because that's actually going to hurt you more, because your arms are going to be so fatigued that it's going to be really hard to punch after that. If you
Yeah.
get crunched underneath somebody into a sprawl, guess what? Your legs are going to be fatigued as fuck. So you have to know when the right time to take your takedown if you want to exchange in grappling, if that's not where you come from.
Right. And I think going back to your first part of the timing, like when we're in the right distance and then we can create an opening for our shot. Like I think there are a couple of cheat codes there. Like yes, I think it's a lot easier to shoot behind your punches, right?
Yep.
So find combinations that work into a shot that can um, almost expose or open up your opponent's defense into a takedown attempt, right? Like behind your punches is a really good time to shoot and you're in control of it, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like shooting off of a slip or off of like a defensive striking is really
Yes.
hard, right? Like, and some people are really good at it and they make it look easy and smooth in the UFC, and that's deceiving because slipping a punch into a takedown is just a hairline away
Yeah.
from eating that
So
punch. And
Jack Shore did that yesterday. It was Jack Shore versus Malquan Americani, and that's how he got the finish. He slipped to the left, ducked underneath to a body lock, got the back, and then choked
yeah,
him out. Right,
right,
which it was fucking beautiful. But you know how hard that is.
really hard, really
It's an
hard.
extremely low percentage way to get a takedown,
Yeah,
unless you're extremely skilled. Which Jack Shore is probably one of the better grapplers in the UFC.
yeah,
The kid's an
exactly.
animal.
And
So,
so throwing your punches though, what that helps with is setting your opponent's feet, right? We talk about
mhm,
footwork ultimately in wrestling is what leads to takedowns, but throwing your punches and creating an angle can get your opponent to sit in their feet and then they have both feet stagnant. That's when our opportunities for shots open up, right?
mhm,
Because then you can get to the hips easier. So getting to the hips by setting your opponent's feet. And then the other thing that I think is a really good cheat code is hand fighting into the clinch. Once you get into
yeah,
clinch, you're definitely in wrestling range, and you can use that contact to get to your setups, to get to your different collar sides, to get to an easier version of a takedown. Yes, your opponent's going to know that it's coming, but then we can execute in a wrestling lens versus have to execute in an MMA or a striking slash wrestling lens.
yeah. And I'm going to skip around right here, Alex. I want to get into the cage wrestling element because it blends really well. So,
Sure.
when we're in that clinch position, so number two is cage wrestling inactivity and disconnecting your upper from your lower body.
Yes.
Um, when we're in that clinch position, and a lot of the times it ends up being on the cage, we have to move both our upper and our lower body. I see time and time again that people are only trying to fight underhooks and not doing anything with their legs other than just stay stable. Or people are trying to move so much with their hips, but their upper body stays stagnant and you just fucking squeeze and you waste a lot of energy. You
Yes.
need to be extremely fluid and move. The upper body and the lower body has to have a purpose behind what you're doing. It's I equate it to training, right? We talk about it all the time. If you train without intent, you're not going to get as much out of your movements and as much out of your sessions. The same can be said in our wrestling and with our cage wrestling. You have to make a movement with intent. If all you're doing is moving to move, that is a waste of energy. And in a
Mm-hmm.
15 to 25-minute fight, you cannot waste energy. Everybody's going to be dog shit tired. No matter who you're, you could be with the greatest strength coach on earth. You could have the greatest team on earth. You fight for 25 minutes, you're going to be fucking exhausted if you went out there and did your thing, right? So, we got to make sure that our movements matter. That being said, when we're in a clinch, a lot of the times I see guys not fighting for wrists. They're just trying to move and trying to shake with their hips. You got to be able to pummel. You got to be able to grab wrists and pull through. That's where arm drags open up. That's where body locks open up. That's what opens up your setup to your next takedown or to your next attack. If all you're doing is moving your feet, that's not actually doing anything for you. That's just making you tired. The same can be said if we get onto the cage, right? My biggest pet peeve is when people get, like, say, like we had a Henry Corrales was fighting a Russian. He was fighting a Daggy, and that's I prepared we prepared him for that all the way leading up to the fight. Where this guy just wants to put you on the fucking cage and hold you there. He'll take you down. He's not going to do any damage, but he wants 15 minutes of control time so that he wins this fight extremely boring, right? How do you work your way off? Well, if what they do well, why the Dagestanis are so fucking good at what they do is that they understand that a lot of people that don't wrestle all the time, like they wrestle 5 to 6 days a week. If you don't wrestle all the time, you don't have the wherewithal to move your body in a way that your upper body and lower body are doing different things to accomplish the same goal. And that's what we have to stress so much if we're on the cage, where you got to fight wrists, but you also have to move your hips. If you want to elevate somebody up to a body lock position off your legs, then you also have to get underneath your underhooks and use your legs to get there. It can't just be jack them up with the upper body, because that's what happens. If you jack them up with your upper body, your hips are going to be out. If you wrestle or if you're fighting a daggy and you try to just jack up with your upper body and you don't use your legs to get there, they're going to snatch a fucking body lock, step in, and put you on your ass into half guard, and then you're going to lay on the ground for 2.5 to 3 minutes. You
Right.
don't get that choice. So if you are in this situation, if you're on the cage, or if you're trying to defend in any way, shape, or form, you need to be doing something with your upper body and also moving your hips back and forth to try to separate and create space. It can't be one or the other.
Right. And like, and how do we do this? How do we instill this as a habit, right? And you hit it on the head earlier when you're talking about intentional practice, right? We have to be intentional with the things that we're doing. And I think it comes from either ignorance or a little bit of arrogance in practice too when we get to our wrestling exchanges, and either we're such good athletes we can get away with doing it with our training partners, or it's like you're on the cage and it's like be active, be active, be active. It's like it doesn't just matter that you're active, it matters what you do when you're
Mm-hmm.
active, right? And so we skip steps in a sense there of like be active. It's like it matters what you do when you be active, so I have to teach you, here's wrist control, here's an underhook, here's moving your hips while you move your shoulders. Like, do these things super intentionally and slow and perfectly and purposefully
Mm-hmm.
before you get to the point of just be active, just go, just move, right? Because that just be active, just move, just go is so draining. It's
Mm-hmm.
so energy draining. And then somebody that's better than you at wrestling is going to be able to capitalize on that because you're getting yourself tired and you're not actually advancing your position,
Yep.
right? So I think we're skipping a lot of steps in our wrestling rooms, in our wrestling sessions by saying just be active, just move, just go. It's like we have to be intentional and we have to be going for the right things. And a lot of wrestlers, if you have a wrestling background, do that intuitively.
Mm-hmm.
They've been wrestling. They know how to do this. They know what a good reaction movement is. Where if you don't know what a good reaction movement is and you just go, it's an inefficient use of energy, right? So
Yep.
we're losing out on that. So we have to teach and become natural to good wrestling movements, to good intentional um, activity, and then we can go to the place of just be active, just move, just go. Because if we do that without it, we're wasting energy, like you said earlier. And
Yeah.
then I
Well,
also,
on that point, so something I tell all my athletes that I work with, the guys that are coming from a striking background into the wrestling lens, is you do one, wrestlers do three.
exactly,
That's a good point for people to understand. If you watch a good wrestler transition in MMA, you watch Henry Cejudo, he has 3 to 5 movements for every one of his opponent.
yeah,
He's going to chain 3 to 5 positions where you're still trying to fight the fucking first position. You don't understand what's happening. So when you're trying to pick this up, because part of this cage wrestling is just straight up inactivity and inability to chain movements, you have to do more movements than you think. You can't just sit there and rest. This is a game of chess, not checkers when we're on the cage. It's if you make one mistake, you can really fuck it up.
hmm,
So you need to be able to have a plan, have that flow chart in the back of your head, and you know your next 3 or 4 steps moving, not just moving to move, moving with intention, which I feel like is the name of the game
yeah.
in cage wrestling.
And that's where you get really good and really dangerous is when those two, three, four, five moves that you do in a row set each other up and feed into each other,
Yep.
right? Because that's another thing I've noticed with a lot of cage wrestling and MMA is like we're only doing one thing. I'm only trying to jack up the unhooks. I'm only trying to sprawl my feet and get wide. I'm only like you have to do a lot of this stuff simultaneously at the same time. But then there's also a lack of setups for our takedowns, right?
Yeah.
Like when we're striking, we're setting up combinations. I'm throwing the one so that the two to land. Then I'm gonna throw the 1-2. Then I'm gonna throw the double jab, right? It's like we're working to a better outcome in our setups. When I'm wrestling, it's like, oh, I'll try this takedown really hard. Oh shit, it didn't work. You know,
Hmm.
or like I'll try dump. He's strong to the dump. Okay, now I'll try body lock. And it's like, no, like go from the dump to the body lock to the dump, and then all of a sudden your body lock lifts there, right?
Hmm.
Like when you start to set your next thing up with your wrestling, with your chain wrestling, that's when you're going to see a lot of success. And John Jones again did it beautifully against Sorogan
Yeah.
in the last few weeks,
Kamaru did
right?
it beautifully against Leon this most recent. In the second
Exactly.
round, the takedown he got with,
Yeah.
he went from tried to do crackdown, crackdown didn't work. He tried to elevate, elevate didn't work. Tried to pull back and like sit him on his ass, that didn't work. And then he went straight back to a jack up and then dumped him again.
Yeah.
He literally did 5 movements. There's no way Leon can stop that because he doesn't have the wrestling background to understand that all of those different positions. And
Right.
guess what? Kamaru took him down. He didn't hold him for long. Talk about cage wrestling. Leon Edwards had such a good game plan. He is the epitome of what I'm talking about, where he has intention behind what he's doing. Every single movement he made was made with a purpose. He was tying up wrists and being able to shoot his butt out. He did enough. If you watch the fight back, his feet were spread far enough that Kamaru could never get a lock on his hips so that he could pull him out and do that double pull that Kamaru does so well.
Yeah.
And he's separating off wrists so he couldn't get his hands locked. That's what his upper body's doing. His lower body is pivoting back and forth, but staying wide and always constantly having a purpose behind where he's planting and how he's moving. So that right there is a perfect example of both guys, where on the offensive side, you need to be able to chain 3, 4, 5, 6 movements in order to get your takedown. But then on the defensive side, there has to be a purpose behind what you're doing. And you could see a clear game plan when he was going out there. That's like my favorite thing when I'm watching
Yeah.
fights and when I'm trying to watch film is when you can see that there was a game plan in place and that athlete knows how to handle the situations. They are prepared for those situations. And that just comes with time on the mat and understanding of the positions.
Yeah, 100%. And then that leads to not falling into our third actually fatal flaw of wrestling and MMA, which is parking, right?
Yeah.
So we get to a position and we just sit there, right? It feels like inactivity, but it's in a wrestling sense. It's when I get tired and I decide this is an okay position just to sit in,
Right. I could hold on for a stalemate.
which for some goddamn reason people always do in the most disadvantaged positions. Don't sit in bad positions. Like
Yep.
it's again, it's something that is close to my heart and a pet peeve. But like we get in deep on a double leg and then we're against the cage and I decide I can just sit and park there, right?
Yep.
Like elbows are going to be raining down. My partner's working on his hand control and defense. Like that's a bad place to sit, right? And then we're going to talk about this in a second, but you get taken down or you pull guard or whatever and then you sit on your back and you
Yep.
just decide, okay, I can sit in the guard, right? Like those are bad positions just to take a rest from. Find an advantage position. If you're looking to park and take a rest, find a really advantaged position. But ultimately, we don't want to be so out of shape or so wrestling disadvantage that we have to sit and rest, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
we're talking about chain wrestling. That's the ideal scenario is that we're going, 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 then we get a takedown. Then we can keep pushing through, keep passing guard, get into the next thing and then the next thing. And then we chain wrestle that way and keep advancing forward. But if we need to park or we need to sit in a position, find a good position,
Right.
please.
Yeah. I don't advocate for stalling,
Yeah.
but I do like if you need to take a break, getting like a body underhook and a step on the cage and you step in between the legs. You know how
Yeah.
hard it is to get out of that position as the defensive man? Like you're going to
You have
keep
good
trying
head
to like
position.
right, yeah, you're going to keep trying to like hip the opponent person is trying to hit like I don't know what the technical name. We used to call it a Jap wizard, but I'm pretty sure that's racist. Um,
You're talking about like a wizard throw, like
yeah, yeah, a wizard throw. That's what it is. So like we used to like a wizard throw is right there, but outside of that, if you step in between their legs, you have a really tight, like not tight, but cinched in body underhook. That's really hard to get out of.
yeah,
So like that, if you need to take a rest, that's a really good position. Double unders. If you have them pushed against the cage with double unders, a really good position to have one or two breaths and then go into your
Yeah,
next attack. But
right,
for the most part, you should have all of your steps in place to get to the most dominating position possible, which is on to I think on top and half guard. For a wrestler,
specifically.
on
Yeah,
top and half
yeah,
guard, you get to sit there for probably a minute. Like you'll get a
yep.
minute of control time if you do it right.
Hmm.
So that's where, if you need to take a breath, that's probably where I would breathe. So why not get to that point and then allow yourself to lock down the position, take your breath, and then continue with your pummeling and getting into your ground and pound or your transitions.
Right, and then we have to identify and recognize too some of the safe positions to park in a wrestling match are the least safe positions to
Oh
park
yeah,
in an MMA match, right?
like
Like
crunched in a sprawl.
exactly, like I shoot that bad shot from distance and they get stuck underneath in a sprawl, and maybe I do have my hands locked around a single leg, right? Wrestling, you may sit there, get a stalemate. MMA, you sit there, you getting rained on and probably TKO'd.
Well, and you know how many times I got Darst in that position?
Exactly. Like, yeah, so you got to recognize positions that are no longer useful to you in MMA wrestling, right? So, like, essentially, anytime you're underneath or on a shot or on your knees, it's a bad MMA position,
Yes.
right? And wrestling on your knees is not good either, but you can get away with it a lot more. But anytime you're on your knees and you're not on top, and I would even argue on top, you should be on your toes until you get to the mount or whatever. But anytime on your knees in MMA wrestling, you're in a bad position. You're parking,
Hmm. Yep.
right? So start to identify those positions, and then, like Austin said, if you're gonna park somewhere, find a really good, stable position where your partner has to work exponentially harder than you to escape that position.
Right. Like I like my two for like actual applicable advice. My two that I've seen work really well are if you have somebody, you have the near ankle and a far wrist on the cage, and you can break them down and then also isolate the other side of the body with that near ankle. That's a great way because that opponent's going to have to work really hard. Typically, their only way to get up is to try to turn their back to the cage, and then you can just drop in with that ankle and cut them back off the cage. So it sets up your next offense. The other one is a lockdown half guard, where you get into a half guard position, you can lock that down, and then you can focus on setting up your next attacks or raining down your ground and pound. But that position right there is really, if you're a good wrestler, it's really hard to get out of from bottom because it's the top man has a lot of leverage on the leg, locking in one of the appendages.
Right. And so, okay, so even if I'm really good at jujitsu, why is our fourth fatal flaw by now? Our fourth fatal flaw, why is playing off your back too much a problem or parking on your back?
Because it looks shitty to the judges.
Amen. Yes, amen.
Like it's you could be a really good jujitsu specialist, right? Um, but if you're on your back, even if you're swinging up fucking attacks left and right, if you're on your back for 4 minutes of a 5 minute round, that looks like you're getting fucked up. Like
Hmm.
that looks like you lost that fight. So I've seen, I mean, one of our shared athletes, she was with me, now she's with you, Vanessa Demopoulos, absolute murderer on her back. Like she might be the best female jujitsu practitioner in the UFC. Not might be, I think she is.
Okay.
And she still spends too much time on her back.
Right.
Like you can't, if you sit on your back for 3 minutes of a 5 minute round, that means you have 3 minutes to do work, but then also you have to use the other 2 minutes extremely effectively, and you better have won the striking exchanges.
Right, and it's a misconception though because like I'm really good at jiu-jitsu, I'm good at attacking off my back. I feel safe on my back, right? So I feel good there, and so I feel like I can sit there, right?
Mm-hmm.
Which is again bad look in the judge's eyes, and then we have to identify the next layer of it too. Is like really good mixed martial artists, even if they are great off their back, they don't sit on their back and stay safe. They're
Right.
constantly attacking, they're using it to sweep, they're moving, they're going. They realize that laying on your back, even if I'm baiting something or I'm working towards a submission, is not a great place to be because that submission is, it's a home run shot, right?
Yep.
Like I might get it, might not, right? But I can't spend 2-3 minutes trying to bait it, trying to bank on that, right?
Right.
So,
Well, so my our striking coach Eddie Cha, he has a rule that if you're dancing on the outside, if that's your game,
Yeah.
You have to land at a 3-1 clip in order to win the round.
Right.
Like that's if you're getting pushed back and you always look like you're on the defense, you better land at a 3-1 clip to win the round. The same should be said about being on bottom. If
True.
you're a fantastic off your back, you better be winging fucking elbows like Nico Price up in this bitch.
Yeah.
Or you better be winging up submission attempts in order to win this round. You
That's
need
my
to be
focus.
so extremely active that there's no question that you won that round.
Best example of this is again one of our Factory X athletes, Brandon Royval. He
The
gets on his
motherfucker's
back.
so good on his back.
As soon as he gets on his back, he's working to his rubber guard, to his omoplata, to his armbar, to a triangle. And then he's getting back up,
Yep.
right? Like he never. And again, this is just him in a nutshell. He never sits still,
Mm-hmm.
but especially when he gets to his back, which happens frequently. And I think again, he's so comfortable off his back, it may be a disadvantage for him. But as soon as he gets to his back, he's going, 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 going. Right?
Yep.
He realizes that that's a bad aesthetic if he just sits off his back. He's going to throw submissions, throw strikes, throw submissions, throw strikes, eventually get back up, and then go throw some more.
Mm-hmm. Yep. You need to constantly put the other person in danger. If you want to play off your back, it literally needs to be constant offense.
Right. And constant offense applies into our last fatal flaw of wrestling MMA, which is throwing off the break, right? Or
Yep.
managing your blend, right? So
Mm-hmm.
in wrestling, we say it all the time, most points are scored in transitions,
Yep.
right? So as soon as I get a takedown, there's near fall available. As soon as I get a reversal, there's near fall. As soon as I get an escape, there's a takedown available, right? So score in your transitions. Same thing can be said in your MMA in your blend. Right off a break off the clinch, there's strikes open there. Right
Mm-hmm.
off, right into the clinch, there's strikes off a break there. As soon as we sit and establish a position, all right, we establish we're a distance, we establish we're in a clinch, we establish the half guard, things become less available
Mm-hmm.
because then our partners or our opponent is ready for defense, right? So managing your blend in a way that you can throw off the brakes, you can constantly stay active, and you can be on the offense 90% of the time is a thing that I feel like should be emphasized in MMA wrestling.
Well, you see it exactly what you said. Scoring in the transitions is where the money's made.
Mm-hmm.
And it's because once you get into a position, the person that stops moving last wins.
Yes.
If we're striking or we're blending or we're wrestling, you see it all the time where the person that takes a breather or the person that doesn't know what their next step should be is typically the person that is going to get scored upon.
Yeah.
When we're doing that for MMA, it's so important to be able to mix your leg attacks or your body attacks with your boxing combos and then knowing when to separate and then get right back into your wrestling or right back into your striking. Like again, I cage wrestling is kind of my thing at this point. When I watch people on the cage, right? So many people just hang on a double leg. They don't decide to you could just roll your thumb, pop, pop, come up top, throw a couple punches, then come back into my double leg. They just want to hang there. And
Mm-hmm.
while that seems or feels like a dominant position, it's actually wasting a lot of energy. You're actually probably using less energy by rolling and throwing and then coming back to your shot than just hanging there and trying to squeeze, right? Because that squeeze is going to fatigue the shit out of your arms. So, what I would recommend is you should watch, for the people back home, coaches or athletes, watch your most recent performances and watch where you take breaks,
Yeah.
where you're taking that time off. And a lot of the times it's in the fourth and fifth effort, whether it's just wrestling or just grappling or striking and grappling. Like an easy way is you can roll like a boxing combo, roll underneath, get into a body lock, roll again, and then get back into your striking combinations, right?
Yeah.
All of those are easy ways to mix in and blend in our offense. And the main point for MMA is offense should be masked. Offense should be surprising. And the only way to make your strikes surprising or your wrestling or your grappling surprising is to mix it all together so that opponent across from you doesn't know what's coming. And I think that's the key point of blending is that you always have to try to break the opponent's rhythm.
Right.
MMA
And
is
I
just
think
a
that
dance.
Right, and that's what we talk about when we talk about like tightening up your game, right?
Hmm.
There's no like stalemates or breaks where it's like, oh shit, where am I going next? Right?
Hmm.
Like it's like I know where I'm going here with my strikes into the clinch. I know I'm throwing elbows from the clinch, and then I know from my elbow I'm going to open up the legs and takedown because he's going to come up. And then once I get my takedown, I know I'm in a half guard. I know I got some ground and pound here. I know I got a control, and then move. And that's when we talk about like tightening up the game. You have an answer for every position and every transition you get into,
Hmm.
right? So there's like your perfect ideal blend is there's no positions you get into where you don't have a solution for them, right? And then
Yep.
that's what gets you into the top 15 in the UFC. And then what gets you to being a champion is you have the right answer, the right solution,
Hmm.
the best solution every time in every transition, right? So um, banking on those transitions, controlling them, and seeing where and what to do is going to be really important in your wrestling and MMA. And I want to highlight that parking or not parking, but getting into a position, establishing a position is going to happen
Yeah,
in
of
every
course.
fight. It's going to
Yeah.
happen, right? So the more we can be ahead of that and plan for that and then control the next transition and then have our solutions for the next transition, the more advantage you're going to do. Like, the thing that keeps going off in my head is yesterday, Gunnar Nelson.
Yeah.
Perfect way. He
Yeah.
melted him. He controlled the transitions, and then he just was so patient and set up. Okay, I know if I take this mount, he's going to turn his back. Arm's going to be free. Armbar right away. He
Hmm.
was controlling the next transition, and then had the perfect solution for it. Right. I got really far in jujitsu from my wrestling background without knowing any jujitsu, just knowing that as soon as my opponent goes for a submission, there's an open door,
Hmm.
right? Because a lot of, again, jujitsu practitioners aren't as good as a black belt at closing all the doors. Your only option is to get submitted.
Yep.
So as soon as somebody goes for a submission, I know there's some escape open for me,
Yep.
right? So you can control your transitions on the front end and be proactive on them, and then when the next transition is going to happen, you can plan for that and be proactive in that as well. And I
Hmm.
think that's, again, another advantage that is really nuanced in mixed martial arts.
Yeah. I mean, people don't always necessarily understand that. I guess the person that makes the least amount of mistake. I mean, I guess they get it, but the person that makes the least amount of mistakes wins, right?
Right.
But if you don't know you're making mistakes in the first place,
Right. And it's
then
not obvious, right? It's not
right.
obvious when you stop in a position and it's like, oh shit, now I'm against the cage and he's got a double. I'm just
Yep.
gonna sit here, right? That's not an obvious mistake.
Right.
It's a mistake, but you're not paying a hefty price for it. You may
Hmm.
pay a price for it ultimately, or over the long run, it may accumulate into a heavy price to pay, but I'm not getting super landed on. I'm not
Hmm.
getting knocked out or submitted from this position. Like it's not an obvious price.
Yeah. And the last thing I'd like to talk about on that and like blending is like
Hmm.
when we think about striking, we always know that it's a chess match, right? It's who can have the best setups. Like if you watch Izzy versus Pahea, it's literally like I think my heart rate just watching the fight got to like 120 because I knew some shit was going to happen. And I'm just sitting there, my heart pumping because I can see them setting up the traps and doing what they have to do. But when we think about grappling, we don't necessarily think about it with that same level of chess mentality.
Right.
Grappling in and of itself is a chess match. I know it's like the brutish style, like wrestling is like, oh, the fucking the meatheads are coming into MMA and they're just gonna grind it out and this grinder mentality. But good grappling is still a chess match. And you have to understand that and you have to be prepared for that. So many people just want to get the conditioning elements of grappling and oh, we do 2 and 2s all day, every day. And we're just gonna do 2 and 2 shots for an hour and a half. And that's what we need from our wrestling. When in reality, we need to focus on what are my pathways? How do I understand these pathways and how do they apply into my own personal game? And then how do I implement the wrestling skills that I can use and that I understand to blend into my striking and then also blend into my jujitsu? That's the entire game of wrestling is just a chess match. And it needs to be that you are not just one step ahead of your opponent, but 3 steps ahead of your opponent.
Yeah.
And the only way for you to be 3 steps ahead is if you know all the fucking steps.
Right.
So
Yeah.
that's where my biggest pet peeve, here's a little extra 6 fatal flaws, is people that just do 2 and 2 drilling for wrestling and they don't actually like train wrestling technique or wrestling skill. Because
Yeah.
the only way to get better is to drill. You can't just go live and flow the entire time. That is not a guided practice. That is not focusing on getting better. The intent of that is just conditioning, not
Right.
making becoming a better wrestler. So
Right.
focus on your pathways, focus on your flow charts, and learn all of the steps that you can so that if you get into a weird position, you know what the fuck you're doing. The opponent might not, but you know what the next step is.
Right. And there's levels to this, and I learned a lot, and I'm gonna reference. I listened to Haja Gracie on the Lex Friedman podcast, and they got into an argument about drilling and going live. Right. Like there's levels to this. There's a time and place for your 2-and-2 drilling. Right.
Mm-hmm.
Get the mechanics of the move, practice being flawless in that technique. Right. But then the next level is to have a flow chart, and then that's where your flow and play wrestling come from.
Mm-hmm.
But at the same time we're doing flow and play wrestling, you can't do it without intent, right? So we're gonna flow and play wrestle, and maybe I'm gonna emphasize on this single leg, right? So maybe my partner's gonna block one or two of the pathways. I have to find a third piece of my flow chart to hit it,
Mm-hmm.
right? So it's that intentional practice, and then we can get a little more creative and open the box a little bit with it. So there's not only levels to performance, there's levels to practice too.
Right. Well, it's the age old. I say it all the fucking time. You got to be a cook before you're a chef. I can't expect
Yeah,
you to freestyle if you don't know the steps that you need to do in the first place.
yeah,
Like
agree.
so many people just want to skip it and just say fuck it, we're live, and just go fucking flow roll when they don't even know. Like they don't even know how to hit an inside trip. They don't know the steps to get to a good inside trip. They're still hitting it with the fucking underhook side or some shit versus being able to understand a position and understand all of the things that could go wrong and could go right. If you know that, you can freestyle the position. Like recently, like I went into Valiant for the first time in like a year this last week, and I was going with a kid named it's one of the Larkin kids. He's going to ASU. This kid is so good.
Mm-hmm.
I I never thought. Granted, he's 19 now. He's not in high school, but high school for all intents and purposes. I never thought I'd say, "Oh, I'm pretty sure this high school would whip my ass." I'm almost 99% positive I might get teched by this fucking high schooler. That's how good this kid is. Like he's gonna walk in and probably win a national title next year. That's how good he is. But he was so comfortable. We were just flowing around just after practice, and I just wanted to feel, just because I've been working with him on some other stuff, just feel what his hips feel like and what his movement is. He literally would just let me take it. Like he would let me hit duck unders, wouldn't even try to stop me. I would be on his back, and he was so fucking comfortable because he's drilled this position so many times that he would just play around, flow. He knew he wasn't going to get taken down because he knew, or he understands that position, and he knows all the steps in his flow chart. As soon as I got on his back, he had a plan in place that he knew exactly where he was going to go from me on his back to him getting on top. Every single
Yeah,
time I got that position, he already had a plan in place of what he was going to do to get on top and get the takedown. And that's
yeah,
extremely impressive. And that's what we need in MMA. You should be so comfortable in every position and know the steps of every position that you know if somebody's on your back, how you get on top. If you're at the cage, you know how you get on top. If your butt is on the cage and they're on a double leg, how do you get to an offensive position? And that all comes from drilling it, drilling it, drilling it. And then once you know the steps, then you can freestyle and play with it and put your own little spin on it.
yep. Amen. You got to be a craftsman, and then you got to be proud of your work.
Yes, sir. So this is our five, technically six, fatal flaws of MMA grappling. If you guys get in touch with us, if you think we're wrong as fuck, all of our information is in the show notes. So
Yep.
Instagram and email are going to be there for you. We have Building a Fighter programs available. We have our monthly memberships. We have our pre-made programs, and we have custom programs available for you guys. That's all going to be at buildingafighter.com. That's again, buildingafighter.com. Check those out. And I would humbly say they're pretty fucking good programs. So I want you guys to try to benefit from that. This is Dr. Austin Shane,
Alex Friedman.
and we are out.